All right, this is the second attempt here for me to record this. I forgot to push record. First time I was lecturing, got 40 minutes into it before I realized that was the case. So if I lack a little bit of enthusiasm in this lecture, that's probably why. I'll try to keep it at a high level of energy as much as I can, but I just went over this and I'm repeating the same stuff again. So anyway, this is the first lecture. Well, we had an intro lecture to the course. This is like really the first lecture on Hinduism, the first tradition that we'll be covering in Intro to World Religions, at least my version of the course. And it's the first unit, obviously, as well, which I'm subtitling the religions of the Indian subcontinent. Okay, so that would include this whole map here, right? You've got, modern day Pakistan and Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, all of this, right, including modern day India, all very geographically isolated. You got all the mountainous regions here over in Pakistan, and then all the mountainous regions here up in Nepal, like right the Himalayas, and all those mountains. So very, like I said, geographically isolated for many years. A lot of other, cultures didn't mix with it, so it kind of developed its own thing. And we're going to be focusing on mainly Hinduism, but also be talking about Buddhism, which really developed even more as it migrated east. So really, Hinduism is more proper to this region. I guess modern day Buddhism is very influenced by Chinese culture, Japanese culture, depending on which form of Buddhism you're talking about. It's not as active in India now as it was, but that's where it came from, right? And then also Jainism, lesser known tradition than Buddhism, but that's another tradition we'll be looking at in this unit. And if you decide to cover it, we'll also go over Sikhism, right? So that's another tradition that developed in this part of the world. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into the lecture on Hinduism, right? We've got this timeline here from our textbook. I'm not going to go over everything. Obviously, you can look at it in the book, but I'll look, I guess I'll do the highlights and mainly the stuff that we'll get to in this first lecture and elaborate on it some more further down the road. This timeline too is debatable. I've seen different dates in different textbooks. Also, we'll have to get used to these abbreviations, BCE and CE instead of BC AD. This is a scholarly thing. It's fairly recent, last couple decades. It hasn't quite caught on. I don't know if it'll ever catch on. I don't really know how I feel about it. It's meant to be politically correct, non-denominational. It stands for the before the Common Era and Common Era. People are used to the BC, before Christ, and Anno Domino, which is like the year of our Lord. That's a Christian calendar, and these dates are Christian. It's based on a Christian calendar, but I guess that that title, Year of Our Lord, or even before Christ, right? Christ is the Greek word for Messiah, and I guess that might be offensive to some Jewish people. So, the Judaic tradition doesn't necessarily recognize Christ as the Messiah. So anyway, scholars have devised these new abbreviations. I don't see them in that many textbooks anymore. But I don't want to spend too much time on this. I think you kind of get the point. Just try to keep that straight. BCE and CE, or what had once been referred to, and still to this day, typically referred to as BCAD. Again, these dates, you get different stuff in different books. These dates go back to 8,000, so eight millennia BCE. This is at least the account you get according to the tradition. This is when the Vedas were originally heard. The Vedas being the original holy scriptures. They were originally carried down orally, right, word of mouth, but they were heard directly by the rishis, which were these sages. We'll talk a little bit more about them a little bit later on in the lecture. When you get to the year 2500 BCE, still, this is when we see the beginnings of the Indus Valley civilization, some of the earliest evidence. And this is where we think we can trace, archaeologically, we can trace back some of the earliest forms of what you might call Hindu religious practice. something associated with this tradition. So I've even heard it going back even further than this, right? So, but this is the textbook date, 2500 BCE. And most scholars, some scholars, are going to say that the actual texts that are called the Vedas, we'll get more into the details of these in just a moment, that these were actually compiled around 1500 BCE, right? So we're going to talk about the Upanishads in a bit. Those are parts of the Veda, and the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. That's 400 BC to 200 CE, and 400 BC to 400 CE. These are the epics. We probably won't talk about them in this lecture. We won't have time. We'll get to that in part 2 of our Hinduism lectures. But these really, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, these epics, right? These texts here are what most common, the layman practitioner of Hindu are going to be reading and celebrating and more aware of. The other things like the Upanishads, the Rig Veda, all the other stuff we'll be talking about mainly in this lecture. Some of the older texts are more esoteric, right? And they're the ones that are read by, some of the more intellectuals, the priests themselves, and things like this. So really the birth of, I guess, what you might call modern Hinduism is really like 2nd, 3rd, 4th century CE, around the same time that Buddhism and Jainism are developing as well in this region, right? About, in northeastern India, and modern day Nepal, Bangladesh, and this region. Code of Manu, this is where a lot of the morals, ethics, ways of life of modern Hindu come from, and this is not until the 2nd through the 4th actually century CE. So again, I'm not going to go through this whole timeline. That would take a while, but this is just sort of like early history, the beginnings of this tradition that we refer to as Hinduism. This is the map here, again, of the Indian subcontinent that's in our textbook. Not the best scan. I have to apologize. It's pretty light. I don't know if it's pretty hard to see depending on probably what kind of screen you're looking at. But again, it's in our textbook. And again, we're talking about the region that now is, these are more modern borders. We've got Pakistan up here to the northwest, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, and of course India. Right? You might even throw in the island of Sri Lanka as well, especially when we get to Buddhism. Buddhism is still a vibrant tradition on that island. It's considered one of the oldest forms of Buddhism, the most original forms, but we'll save that till we get to the Buddhist chapter. So first off, the name Hindu, right? The word Hindu, Hinduism, it was coined by foreigners. So, and it's really maybe a bit misleading. It comes from a Sanskrit word, Sindhu, which is the name for the Indus River. It's applied to the people of the region of the Indus River Valley. And it was originally introduced, as you see here on the slide, by Westerners, namely, more specifically, the British under colonial rule in the 19th century. And it was a category for census taking. They want to know your religion. They just said, oh, they're a Hindu. But in your textbook, they give you this alternate label, and I'm spelling it a little different. And in the book, I think there's an extra A. It's Sanatana Dharma. But I'm used to hearing Santana Dharma from Hindus themselves, at least the American Hindus that I know, that I've encountered and talked to, and they spell it this way. So I'm just going with this, okay? So hopefully it doesn't confuse you too much. The textbook, again, slightly different. Maybe it's pronounced Sanatana Dharma, and they speak so fast when they say it to me that it sounds like Santana Dharma. But I have literature from Hindu temples that spells it this way. So this is how I have it in my presentation. But the term Santana Dharma, which I guess is technically more accurate, this is what the locals may refer to this tradition that the British and maybe Americans, Westerners, will refer to as Hinduism. It comes with these terms Sanatana and Dharma, right? So Sanatana means eternal, ageless, and this is typical of most of the religions that we're going to be covering, if not all of them in this course. The idea is that this belief system has gone back to the beginning of all time, It's always existed, right? Maybe the scripture was written at a certain time and there's a history to it, but the actual teachings go back till, to eternity, to all eternity. They're outside of time in a certain sense, right? They're cosmically true. Dharma, that term dharma, can mean many things, right? As many things in many contexts. It can mean religion, duty, uh, what's best for the community, a way of life, a discipline, a code of ethics, one's health or well-being. It can also be used as a term for meditation, meditative practice. And really, I think maybe a good general understanding of it is that Dharma is this holistic approach, right? This, if we remember back to the first lecture, the definition of religion from Theodore Ludwig, he gave that sort of 4-point definition, and one point was it's a complete system of symbols, right? So it's a holistic, you know, approach. Dharma is, right. It gives you this prescriptive way of fitting into the world, into society, for the good of all, and balancing yourself with this cosmic order. Okay, I think enough about that, right? What's really misleading though about throwing a term like even Santana Dharma, even though I guess that's more accurate, but certainly Hinduism, is it seems to encompass way too much. There's so many different forms of religious practice, spirituality that would fall under this category. If you go to India and you go to different regions of India, you're going to find different people practicing it in different ways, having different understandings of even the same deities. Um, as the textbook puts it, right, you're going to find forms of extreme asceticism, right? This lifestyle, this philosophy that adheres to a very austere, sort of stoic existence, depriving oneself of any sensual, physical pleasures. And then you'll find forms of Hinduism that embrace the exact opposite, devotional practices that celebrate uh, forms of experience that you might consider extremely sensual. You also have practices like bhakti yoga, which are these intense, prayer, personal devotion practices devoted to a personal deity. If you're a Catholic or familiar with Catholicism, and or you maybe know the notion of a patron saint, there's a similarity here, right? We might go from something like that as a form of Hinduism. Again, we call this a bhakti yoga. We'll get into that in the next couple lectures. All the way to very abstract intellectual philosophy, stuff that you might find on the same grounds, the same sort of level as a Plato or Aristotle. You also have different philosophies that are encompassed under this umbrella term, Hinduism, Santana Dharma. There's a metaphysics that'll declare the oneness of the universe, the oneness of the cosmos, a sort of monistic, monotheistic approach. In fact, I would say the vast majority, if not all, the Hindus I've ever met in America are very offended when they are called a polytheist. They don't think that their faith is polytheistic. They insist it's a monotheistic tradition, that they understand God as one, and there's one ultimate God, and all these deities that we see in the Hindu temple are just different manifestations or expressions or aspects of the one divine nature. But then you have, obviously, like I mentioned, different images, different statues, different devas. That's the term. We'll get into this in a little bit. Different deities that represent a multiplicity of divine beings. You see all sorts of symbology, right, which lends itself to a polytheistic interpretation. In fact, the documentary, one of the documentaries that I share on our course website is called 330 Million Gods. That's the Hindu documentary. It's a very old documentary from the BBC from the late 70s, mid to late 70s. So I'm afraid it's maybe a little slow paced for the modern viewer, but I think it's pretty informative, and I find it pretty interesting and very fascinating, honestly. Maybe somewhat outdated. So this is a kind of a simplified timeline that's going to get us through like the early history of the tradition. And these are very rough dates, I should add, to very emphasize that. All of this is highly speculative. We're basing this on old archaeological evidence. And again, depending on what textbook you read, you might get, you might get a few that go back further. Some might date it a little bit later. But this Indus Valley civilization that I mentioned earlier briefly when we were going over the textbook timeline, we think it probably began around 6500 BCE, maybe as far back as 8000 according to some sources. Okay, this is the culture from which sprang modern, well, I wouldn't say modern Hinduism, but it's the seed that eventually developed into modern Hinduism. Now, the Aryan invasion, if it did happen, now that this is pretty controversial, more on that in just a moment. If the Aryan invasion happened, this sort of Indo-European invasion, it probably happened around 2000 BCE or maybe 1500, as late as that. Okay, so these Indo-European socio-linguistic culture, they sort of bring their polytheistic traditions in. The Aryans didn't have a written language, although the Indus Valley had some sort of hieroglyphic system we haven't really quite been able to fully decipher. But the Aryan invasion theory sort of goes that many of the Vedas, these early scriptures, were actually brought down into the Indus Valley from these invading tribes, right? These invading Aryans, and they originally they preserved these stories orally through mantras, right? A mantra would be some sort of, a poem or a song or just a repetitive saying that was seen as devotive of the gods or the devas. And it literally means timeless, eternal, or true. That's what the word mantra literally means. But when we're talking about mantras, that's usually what we're referring to, or songs or devotional hymns to the gods. Now, I have these two developments during this time period underneath the Aryan invasion. Vedism is considered kind of one of the most early forms of an organized type of religion in this region. It's sort of one of the earliest forms of what you might call Hinduism or Sanatana Dharma. And this is, again, according to the Aryan invasion theory, this is from the development of the Vedic literature that came from the Europeans. Now, some modern scholars and Hindu nationalists are gonna push back on that. But regardless, the Vedic tradition, sort of the Vedism that we're referring to here, was more of a sacrificial practice, sacrificing animals and doing sorts of rituals and dances and providing burnt offerings, chants, music, mantras, that kind of thing, devoting yourself through to the gods through those means, through actions. Brahmanism is a more meditative practice. This is more of a turning inward as a way towards the divine. And by 600 CE, this is when the epics have been completed, the epics that are still celebrated within the Hindu tradition today, the Mahayana and the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. This is really the beginning of modern day Hinduism. And again, like I said earlier, this is around the same time that you see Buddhism and Jainism appear in India. So these are some photos that I was able to cull from just a quick Google search on the internet, right? These are some pottery figurines from the Indus Valley, okay? These are actually ruins on the left here, okay? So the, the Indus Valley, itself was pretty elaborate, right? At least we consider it pretty elaborate given the time that it was that we date it back to. It had pretty elaborate plumbing. They had a plumbing system, irrigation systems, paved right-angled streets. Not all the cities had this, but many of the cities within this region had it. According, of course, to the Aryan invasion theory, the religious traditions, though, really started to flourish when these tribes came in. Now, see, some of these figures, they mention in the book that it's believed that many of the early religious traditions involved worship of female gods or female devas, goddesses, and they point to evidence like this. It's, again, I'm not an archaeologist, so I don't really know what the argument against would be, but typically archaeologists assume that if you find well-preserved figurines from way back when, they're probably some sort of object of devotion. And so the assumption here is that obviously these are female, and so to some extent the female or the goddess or some sort of goddess was worshipped. Okay, so all sorts of different types of tradition can be traced back to this. We'll look at some more archaeological evidence for other types of religious practices. But yeah, and here's some more of the Indus Valley figurines. This is Max Muller. He's a German philologist. A philologist would be somebody who studies classic languages and just language in general today. But back then it was somebody who studied classical languages, early ancient languages like Sanskrit. Most of, if not all, I think all of the Vedas were written in Sanskrit, one of the earliest languages, oldest languages that we know of, and we can still more or less translate. So again, Max Muller was a philologist, and he's often credited, with this Aryan invasion theory, which was, had a lot of currency up until recently. The idea is that these Indo-European tribes, they migrated, they invaded from the steppes of southern Russia, and brought with them some of their traditions. Now, like I said, this theory is being pushed back on, and especially the newer versions of the textbook, I think, give it even less credence than some of the earlier ones. I have like the 7th edition, and really, I think there's probably some evidence against this. For one, none of the Vedas speak about some migration, but they do speak about the beauty of the homeland, around the Indus Valley, and they don't call it India. That's not the name of it yet. But again, this is a widely contested theory. And again, current evidence actually shows that there were probably more likely smaller migrations, a few migrations here and there, rather than one just big explosion and invasion of culture. So again, if you evaluate the religion of India, if you evaluate the religion of India on a whole and the history of it, it seems to be like a slow, continuous development rather than just some big spurt like out of nowhere. This tradition just popped up. These also are, I guess, hieroglyphs, you might call them, that were found near the Indus Valley civilization. Some of them depicting obviously animals. And again, maybe this is evidence for worship of nature. It could be evidence for the sacredness of cows, even going back that much further. You've got also evidence of yogic practice. See, this looks like somebody who's in a meditative pose. And the horns there might even be evidence, some might say, of Shiva, the god Shiva. But anyways, all this is really highly speculative. That really does look like somebody meditating. I don't know what else that could possibly be. As far as what the crown on the person's head, for all we know, I think it could be, a sign of royalty or nobility or something like this. But others might say, oh, this is an early version of, the god Shiva. Now, the Vedas, I've been talking about the Vedas, and let's pause here a minute and actually look at some of the, divisions within this large, just broad canon of text. The Hindu canon, the Hindu scripture is immense. You could spend your whole life reading this stuff. But we refer to these early texts, these early scriptures, as the Vedas. And they're you can kind of break them down into these 4 parts. The Samhitas are the earliest, and these are the ones that focus mainly on praise and worship of the deities, or like we're going to start calling them the Devas. That's a more proper name for them within this tradition. And the Brahmanas further elaborate on how to perform ritual sacrifices and such to the deities. So the Samhitas are more like poetry, mantras, and the Brahmanas are more like directions on how to sacrifice, what to do. The Aranyakas, and these are the ones I know the least about, these are the forest treaties. The idea is that these wise men went out into the forest and secluded themselves from society. They were ascetic, so they deprived themselves of all the niceties of the cities, and they lived a very austere existence. And then they came out of the forest with this newfound wisdom as a result of their meditative retreat. and the Aranyakas are seen as products of this. The Upanishads are similar. The idea is that these wise teachers were able to transmit their spiritual teachings to their students. And the term is Upanishad, it literally means mere sitting. So you're supposed to picture this disciple sitting close to the wise master, and the wise master imparting his spiritual light upon the disciple. The rishis are believed to be the wise men who are written, these holy, wise, cosmically in tune individuals who originally heard the Vedas. So they were these ancient sages, and the idea is that they heard the Vedas directly from the breath of the eternal, right? These truths, again, are ageless, they're timeless. They're not really the works of humans, these teachings, but they were just heard directly by these rishis and eventually written down according to tradition by Vyasa. Okay, so Vyasa literally means collector. And originally it was thought that this was one person, but now many just think it's almost like if you're familiar with the Greek poet Homer. Most scholars today, or at least I know it's very debatable, but the consensus seems to be that most of the Iliad and the Odyssey and what we have of Homer is really not all just him. It's a part of a Homeric tradition, and the final version that we have from us is the work of many different people compiling it all together, right? But traditionally, again, Vyasa is understood to be this, the guy that, he takes the work of the rishis who directly heard these truths and transmitted them orally, to their disciples. He eventually sat down and wrote it all down, right? Wrote it out all down in the Vedas. Now, the Rig Veda, this is part of the Samhitas, right? This is part of those earliest texts, but the Rig Veda is the earliest of all. This is one of the oldest texts that we really know of in the world, right? It's not just one of the oldest Vedic scriptures, it's among one of the world's oldest scriptures in the entire world. And in this book, we get this, again, praises, hymns, mantras to what are known as the Devas. So the Devas are these controlling forces in the cosmos. You can maybe understand them as deities who consecrate different aspects of life, right? So Indra, pictured here, he's the god of thunder. And oftentimes Indra will be used as evidence by people like, Max Muller, who want to assert, the Aryan invasion theory. They'll say, well, look at all these gods in the early Vedas. Indra's just a different version of Zeus, or the god of thunder. There's all sorts of god of thunder. Yeah. So to me, maybe I think he could be correct, but also you got to understand the guy was probably biased. He was a German. He probably thought the Germans were superior, Europeans were smarter. How could these Indus Valley people come up with such an interesting and rich tradition of literature? They must have been influenced by Europeans. But, thunder, lightning, these are really powerful elements, especially to somebody who's primitive and doesn't understand the science behind them. So the fact that somebody else came up with the god of thunder, I don't think that that's too far-fetched. It's coincidence. It could be just a coincidence. Everybody has an experience of thunder, and to deify it, it's not so far-fetched. Here's some more pictures of Indra, right? This is Indra keeping the sleeping giant Brahman, like the deity of the universe, in his cosmic cycle, right? In his cycle of dreaming and keeping all reality in suspense. So the Deva Agni is the god of fire, and oftentimes I will get confused and I'll refer to a god as a goddess, because if you look at some of these depictions of the Devas, even the male Devas look very feminine. They have these very pretty faces. They're very androgynous, right? And I think that is intentional. They're supposed to be very fair and beautiful, so they're often portrayed this way. They have these, and we'll talk a lot more about how they have these two aspects to them later, a male and a female form. But we don't want to complicate things a little any more than we have to yet in this first lecture. But some more. That's another image of Agni, the god of thunder. But some more devas that are mentioned in the Rig Veda in the early literature is Soma, who's associated with the sacred drink, and then Ushas, which is the goddess of dawn, right? The goddess of light, the goddess of the dawn. So behind all of these devas, right? Behind all of these individual forces, these myriad aspects of divinity, there was ultimately perceived eventually, right, when Vedism starts to develop into Brahmanism, there's to perceived one reality. There's this unseen reality that sustains everything that exists, that keeps everything that exists in existence, that is ceaselessly creating. So all new things that are created come from this source, and encompasses all time, space, and causation. Later on, this force, especially when we get to the Upanishads, begins to be referred to as Brahman, right? Oftentimes, in fact, always, I usually have been told that this is Brahma without the "in" at the end. I've looked online and I found evidence for this. Your textbook keeps using Brahman, so I'll say that. That's what I'll do. But a lot of Hindus that I've met will say Brahman, and that's what they're talking about. And usually they'll actually say God, especially if it's an American Hindu. They'll just use the word God. That's just what they mean. So, and God is all-encompassing. God is everything, is everywhere, is everything. All of these devas are just aspects of that, right? Or maybe even cosmic messengers, you might say. So, I'm jumping way too far ahead, right? Let's say a few things about the Upanishads, and then we'll come back to Brahman. So the Upanishads, these are the fourth of the divisions here, right? We were talking about all the different Vedas. The Upanishads are the near sitting, right? The spiritual teachings of these enlightened masters. So you're supposed to be reading them and imagining these humble disciples sitting in the presence of the rishis, right? And gaining these mystical insights. So again, the rishis sought the ultimate reality through meditative practice. Within the Upanishads, we see the emphasis turn away again from sacrifice and all sorts of dances and ritual, and turning inward to a meditative, more introspective approach to understanding and relating to the divine. And this ultimate reality, right, Brahman, is supposed to be understood and sought through meditation. Now, the Upanishads in general are not taught to the masses. These are for the priests. These are for the intellectuals. These are for the upper castes. We'll talk more about the caste system in a later video. But these are things that you're not going to meet a lot of Hindus. They might know a quote or two from the Upanishads, but they're not going to be reading this all the time. They're going to be focusing mainly on the epics, which we'll talk about in the next lecture. Probably we'll get to the epics. But again, the Upanishads are very widely read by Western philosophers. They're studied in philosophy classes, but to the laity, they're not quite as broadly read as the Rig Veda, passages from Rig Veda, and especially from the epics. So again, the Upanishads are going to be focusing on inner experience as this path towards realization and even towards immortality. This talk about becoming immortal and timeless. And in fact, let me read. There's actually a passage here I'll read that's in your textbook. I think it's on page 77. Let me see if I can find it real quick. This is just a very short, just to give you sort of a taste of the kind of stuff you'll find here. In the beginning was existence alone, and the word existence is capitalized, right? You know how in like the Christian tradition, if you refer to God as with a pronoun he or him, or even the divine, and you're talking about God, you have to capitalize it. Same thing here, right? In the beginning there was existence, so capital E. So Brahman is existence. That's one of his things. He is all that exists, all that has time, space, whatever. In the beginning there was existence alone, one only. So there's a monism, a monistic, a simplicity, a unified element to this approach of understanding our cosmos. So in the beginning, there was existence alone, one only, without a second. He, the one, thought to himself, let me be many, let me grow forth. Thus, out of himself, he projected the universe. And having projected out of himself the universe, he entered into every being. All that is has itself in him alone. Of all things, he is the subtle essence. He is the truth. He is the self. And that art thou. So you, as an individual, are this being. All of us are this being. It is a sort of illusion that we are separate from the oneness of this being. Of course, you could read polytheistically into that passage, though. I encourage you to look in your textbook and read over that and see how you might be able to interpret that in a very polytheistic way, not necessarily seeing everything as one. And in fact, in our next lecture, we'll start out by going over the different philosophical systems, the different theological approaches to some of these texts, right? But we don't really have time for that now. We're coming pretty close to the end of this lecture. But let's get back to the PowerPoint here. Let's get back to the slideshow, right? So again, the idea is that through meditative practice, you can become one with this eternal truth, right? Brahman. And you find this within yourself, right? Within what's called the Atman. This is the subtle self. This is the, some might translated as permanent self, true self, subtle self is how your textbook has it. Once you tap into that true Atman, that subtle self, typically through meditation or some other sort of practice, some other devotional practice. Once you do this, you become one with Brahman, right? Your Atman is Brahman, right? They merge. And you see yourself as one with the universe as you truly are. And some terminology here, right? And again, these doctrines here, we're still sort of talking about the Upanishads. This is where, in the Upanishads, this is where a lot of these doctrines are really developed fully. So even though, as I said earlier, you might not find a lot of laity, a lot of Hindu practitioners who are reading the Upanishads, the Upanishads surely have a big influence and a deep impact on religious practice within this tradition we call Hinduism. So again, reincarnation, first off, that's the first word I have up here. This idea that the soul, or the Atman, it migrates after death, right? It migrates to another form. And so hopefully it advances. The idea is that you die and you're reborn better than you were before. If you live a good life and you practice the faith, the Dharma correctly, then you will be advanced spiritually in your path. Eventually, though, you want to release yourself from this cycle of reincarnation. The way to do that is to keep your karma in check, right? The word karma, honestly, I think the Westerner usually gets it misinterprets it. They talk about bad karma and good karma. Really, karma is just bad. It's just action. The word is action, and you want to disturb things as little as possible. So you want to lower your karmic influence, right? And be as subtle and as non-violent and intrusive in the cosmic order as possible, right? So karma is really, it's action coupled together with its consequences. It's not just your action, but the ramifications of your actions. That's how it's understood in Hindu theology generally. There's a quote from your textbook: "As a man acts, so does he become." You become what you do. And this is very literally true, especially when you take into account their understanding of reincarnation. You become what you do. If you're an evil, ugly, bad person, you're going to come back as an evil, ugly, bad being and have a very miserable existence. That's the idea, okay? Now, this cycle of birth, death, and rebirth is known as samsara, okay? So that's this continuous cycle that the Atman is stuck in. It keeps getting reborn. And so the goal is to reach enlightenment and to escape this cycle, to escape samsara, and to achieve what's known as moksha, right? This is the Hindu word for, you might call enlightenment, release from the cycle of samsara. It's a liberation from the limitations of space, time, matter, and you become one with the absolute. You become immortal in a certain sense, right? This realization of the immortal absolute. You're no longer a separate self to be reborn. You are at one with Brahman, right? And these notions too, samsara, moksha, reincarnation, karma, we'll see as we go further through the course and we start to study other traditions, particularly Buddhism and Jainism, that these ideas are very influential in those traditions as well. And so that's about all I wanted to do for this lecture. I think that's enough for part one. We're going to get into these three major philosophical systems, ways of approaching Hindu theology. There's a lot more than three, but these are the three major ones again, we'll talk about them next time, but maybe I'll just mention them here in this video just to close off. Samkhya, Advaita Vedanta, and then yogic practice. So that's what we have to look forward to next class, next meeting, however you want to put it. And that will be up pretty soon, probably within the next day after this one is posted. So thanks for sticking around till the end of the video. I hope it was informative. You can always go back and rewatch it if you're one of my students. Take good notes. Make sure you do good on the Hindu quiz. And again, thanks a lot. Cheers for being around, and I'll see you on the next one.